Welcome back, everyone, to the fourth rendition of the Mile High Mana podcast. We got a special one here today. He and I decided that we were going to sort of take a step away from our usual cadence of talking about what's going on in Magic week over week. But today, our primary focus will be on a topic that I know Lee and myself hold pretty near and dear to our heart, and that is a full rundown on the Delver deck in Legacy. We're going to run from basically 2011 Delver all the way up to current state Delver. I know, a lot of folks out there have viewed Delver as true north of the Legacy format for the lion's share of its existence. So I think that this was a really good, appropriate episode that hopefully we can keep everyone engaged with. And I hope this is going to be helpful to understanding not only the history of Delver, but also really the history of Legacy as it sort of follows this tempo deck. Lee?
Yeah, perfect. This was quite a homework assignment. It was like more than I had anticipated when I put this together, but I'm pretty happy with how it turned out, and it's pretty awesome actually to look at the Legacy format through this lens, right? Because it's kind of always been at the top of the metagame in some way, shape, or form. And anyway, why don't you tell the audience, I guess, who are not super familiar with Delver or don't play a lot of Legacy, kind of what the core of the deck is, and then we'll go into the history piece of it.
Yeah, no doubt. So Delver, as it stands, has always been referred to as Delver, and what's referencing there is the card Delver of Secrets, released in original Innistrad. Now, you might be wondering why this sort of common from a standard set has had such an iron-like grip on Legacy year over year over year, and how it's always maintained consistency in the format and in each Legacy meta. And that's because it's really, really powerful and unique in the way of how it interacts with the core of what makes Legacy such a cool format. I guess the best way to put it is it's the most true tempo deck that I believe exists in Magic the Gathering. Mostly that's just because I'm partial to it and I love the Delver deck and I love Legacy. But when I think of tempo, I always think of Delver because we look at cards that have been in the core of the deck in its entire existence supporting this 3/2 flyer and king making it. So what king making is basically you protect the king and let the king run you to victory. And so cards like Force of Will and Daze are really powerful in the fact that they're free interaction and they can help protect your Delver against removal spells or anything in the matter that would ultimately remove your king. It's also bolstered by the ability to have access to a large portion of your deck throughout the game, and that comes from cantrips like Brainstorm, Ponder, Preordain in some eras of the deck, and then now we see 4 Mishra's Bauble, so we're effectively playing a 56-card deck with 8 cantrips. So that's a lot of cards that you look at each and every game. So you'll be able to find really what you need to help protect the king. And then it's not just Delver 2 over the years that has been the only king that we're building in this tempo deck. We've seen cards from, Nimble Mongoose to Murktide Regent to Deathrite Shaman. Dragon's Rage Channeler is a current threat in the deck as well. It's really an idea and a concept more than it is just about a card nowadays. So the mana base also includes some of the best mana in the game. So typically 6 or more blue dual lands, depending on the variant. We've seen single color mono blue Delver decks. We've also seen 4, even 5 color Delver decks as well. So some combination of blue duals, up to 8 fetch lands. I've seen 9 sometimes as well. And then 4 wastelands, which the deck I think often treats more like a spell than it does an actual mana producing land, because the combination of wasteland and Daze really putting a stranglehold on your opponent's mana is what allows for some of these cheap threats to really get in and end the game.
Yeah, perfect. I think the thing that always kind of pulled me to the Delver deck is it was simply the most efficient, highest rate cards that you could play, right? Like obviously the blue cards in Legacy are extremely good, and that most of the threats that the deck has played over time cost 1 mana or 2 mana. We did see a brief period of time that we'll talk about in the middle where we played True Name Nemesis at 3 mana because there were simply no answers to it in the format, but for the majority of Delver's history, it simply was like the most efficient high rate cards that you could play and the most consistent total deck, both with mana base and with cantrips that you could play. So it really was just like the benchmark, if you will, for what was possible in Legacy.
Yeah, and you see a ton of metas formulate a plan around the Delver decks. Every deck has to have Daze and Wasteland in mind in the deck building process, and that largely comes from the success of the Delver deck over the course of, almost 15 years.
Yep, for sure. Well, I guess we'll get started with the original Delver deck, which was Canadian Threshold. It was called Canadian Threshold because it actually originated out of Canada. Jacob Wilson was one of the original innovators of the deck. And it basically played all the cards we talked about, but also played 4 Stifle, 2 Spell Pierce, 2 Spell Snare, and ran a very limited threat base of 4 Delver of Secrets, 4 Nimble Mongoose, which is a one and a green shroud, or one green shroud creature that becomes a 3/3 if you have 7 or more cards in your graveyard, and Tarmogoyf as a real beater. And it really played the mana denial plan better than any deck that I've ever seen in Legacy. And this is the deck that really got me excited to play Legacy. It was the first deck that I bought in Legacy. It was the first deck that I played, and it really dominated for a long time. So I think somewhere kind of early to mid 2011 was when Delver was printed, and all the way until kind of the end of 2012 when Deathrite Shaman entered with Return to Ravnica. It was clearly the best deck in Legacy for a long time. It won most of the events. It was kind of fighting with the Miracles deck, although the Miracles deck actually didn't really exist in its true form until Terminus was printed, which kind of came later in the Innistrad block. So for that initial period when Delver was printed, it really kind of dominated. And then we started to kind of get this pull back and forth between the Terminus decks on the far side playing Sinsai's Divining Top and Counterbalance as the control end of the spectrum of Legacy, starting kind of later in 2011. And then the Delver decks on the opposite side, like the leanest kind of tempo focused deck. So those two decks kind of like defined what blue fair decks in Legacy look like. If you were playing Ponder and Brainstorm and Force of Will, you were in really one of those camps. And that was kind of my introduction to Legacy from the beginning. And I always thought it was really fun, that like juking back and forth. It's interesting if you go back and watch some of the content from that era. Everyone's playing around Stifle. All the blue Delver decks have 4 Stifle in their deck, so you'll have a bunch of games of Legacy where the first 3 turns of the game are just like fetch land pass, fetch land pass, fetch land pass, and like the players kind of go back and forth and have to figure out who wants to try to like break the fetch lands first and who wants to begin the fight. So anyway, that if you've never played the decks from that time, it'd be fun to go back to 2011 or 2012 Legacy and play Rug Delver versus the field, because it was a real test of skill. And it was one of those decks that you worked on the finest of margins. Like, you really had to figure out where to pick your spots, because the deck had 0 card advantage at all. And a lot of the spells that you play, like Stifle, only really trade with very specific things like Fetchland activations or Wasteland activations, right? So you really had to pick your spots. But anyway, I digress a little bit. But I know there's a lot of Legacy fans out there who still consider Rug Delver or Canadian Threshold to be kind of like the peak of what Delver was.
So I'm curious, Lee. I didn't play in this era of Delver, but I can see how these play patterns would tremendously impact, what the mirror would look like. And we always talk about building for being on the draw, especially when we build our sideboards and we collaborate and consult each other on preparing for events. I'm curious, in the Canadian Threshold mirror match, we're talking about 4 Stifle, 4 Wasteland, 4 Daze, 4 Force of Will, 4 Spell Pierce, or sorry, you said 2 Spell Pierce. Was it just like very difficult to win on the draw? What was the typical play pattern? Because it almost seems to me like the 2 decks are playing very different games despite being almost identical.
Yeah, definitely winning the dice roll was a big deal, but a lot of times you just had to be like more conservative with your keeps and keep higher land count stuff, because there's no basics in these decks, right? So you really had to keep like 2 and 3 landers a lot of time if you knew that you were playing the mirror. And then typically the first person to blink would lose. So a lot of times what you'd like to do is just make your land drop and pass the turn, and then kind of begin the fight. It changes a little bit post board because everybody gets access to Pyroblast, so you can kind of interact with Stifle on the stack a lot easier with Pyroblast in your deck. And then I recall the mirror breaker oftentimes was Sylvan Library, because it was a card that these decks simply couldn't interact with. Nobody could get it off the battlefield. So if you found a way to resolve Sylvan Library, you were really, really far ahead in the mirror.
Okay, that's interesting. Nowadays, I don't, think Sylvan Library would even be considered for the Delver mirror because of how fast everything is now. And you just activate Library twice, or I guess you would pay for 2 cards, and you're going to end up dying faster than you can even use them.
Yeah, Yeah, but the games did end up going really long. Like when everybody had Pyroblast post board and everything could trade back and forth. Like if you could play a long game and get all the selection from library, it was quite good. But yeah, it seems a little quaint in retrospect for sure.
Cool. Yeah, I like that. And that's a I think a really good sort of intro point because after the Canadian Threshold deck, it seems to me like Delver just absolutely goes through an identity crisis over the course of 2 or 3 years afterwards from the printing of I know one of your favorite cards, Deathrite Shaman.
Oh yeah, Deathrite Shaman just changed everything. I think I told the story last time about going to GP Columbus and then just getting destroyed by Deathrite Shaman, right? So October 2012, Deathrite Shaman gets printed, and it really makes the Stifle mana denial plan not feasible because everybody has a Birds of Paradise basically on the first turn. So that really fundamentally changes Delver. And then, so you from I guess like the end of 2012 and through most of the entirety of 2013, you played some sort of underground sea based Delver deck. So that could be a Grixis Delver deck. We also saw a lot of bug Delver decks. So these were kind of categorized as a deck called Team America, where you play Deathrite Shaman, Hymn to Torok, and Tombstalker. So this deck really attempted to kind of like go bigger in the Delvermere and have actual card advantage in Hymn to Torok and have a threat in Tombstalker that at the time like really couldn't be killed by anything outside of Swords to Plowshare. So if you look at the Delver decks from 2013, you see a lot of these kind of rug decks, and then you see a lot of these Team America kind of bug decks that are really more kind of mid-rangey. And I played both at the time. So I ultimately kind of always liked having Lightning Bolt in my deck, but I did play around with the Bug Delver decks with him to Torok, and like it is pretty amazing if you get to play Deathrite Shaman on turn one, and then turn two you get to play like multiple spells plus him to Torok because you have 3 mana on the second turn. It was a really powerful thing to be doing with Daze in your hand, so that was pretty fun. I don't know, and for some reason I just have like some affinity for Tombstalker. That card is just awesome.
Yeah, no doubt. And for those that don't know, so him is referring to him to Torok, which is a black sorcery. It is your opponent discards 2 cards at random, or I guess target opponent discards 2 cards at random. And you'll often see if you go back and watch old coverage, folks shuffling their hand together, laying it face down, and then rolling dice. If there's 3 cards left in their hand, they'll do, 2, 4, 6, pick the one that you keep. So there was a lot of really great just coverage of seeing that card resolve, and especially for folks like me that have just tried to go back through the history. And I still think that a lot of those older matches are super entertaining to watch.
Yeah, no, they really are, and you can find some old coverage. Luckily there's some Twitch channels now that stream like old Legacy content or old GP content, and if you get lucky enough, you can find some old coverage and watch those guys battle back and forth. So anyway, that kind of brings us to 2013, somewhere kind of in the middle to late 2013. True Name Nemesis gets printed. If you're not familiar with True Name Nemesis, it's 1 blue for a 3/1 merfolk, and you get protection from the chosen player. So basically, your opponent can't target or block True Name in any capacity. So really, it just ended up being like a Delver of Secrets, basically, that was unkillable and unblockable. It was kind of a threat that really couldn't be interacted with unless you Force of Willed it or Pyroblasted it on the stack. So True Name kind of fundamentally started to change how the Delver decks were built. And then there was a couple of different variants at this time, sort of towards the end of 2013, as we moved towards kind of like the first set of Eternal Weekend results that I was able to find. Right before then, Owen Turtenwald won a Grand Prix Washington, D.C. with the Jeskai Delver variant that was pretty new at the time. It was basically the blue-red Delver core, but it splashed Tundra for Stoneforge Mystic, Umezawa's Jite, and Batterskull, and Plow, basically. So that you kind of, again, got to do what the Team America Bug Delver deck was doing earlier that year, in that you could go bigger than the kind of low to the ground tempo decks, but you could kind of compete with the Miracles deck with True Name Nemesis because they couldn't plow it or kill it. They had to terminus it away, basically. So that deck was kind of brought onto the scene. And you can actually find some old coverage of Grand Prix Washington, D.C. 2013 of Owen playing the deck, and he plays it just amazingly well.
Yeah, I think that was like also right before Owen hit the peak of his career as far as Magic is concerned. And yeah, I think he won like Player of the Year not too long after that. But I know he's been largely exited from the Magic Society, so I won't spend too much more time on him. But I do know that I believe it was GPDC that he had a feature match against Denver own Sam Pardee, and I think that that one is worth going back and watching if the listener hasn't already. Just two really high level players going after it with two very different Delver decks.
Yeah, that's cool. I'll have to dig that one up. That sounds pretty fun. I haven't looked at that in a long time.
And then this is our first mention of Eternal Weekend. Was the first Eternal Weekend in 2013?
It's the first one I could find results for. So I
Okay.
guess. I'm not sure.
Oh, very cool. Yeah, that goes back ages. So, and then this one, yeah, it looks like Osip Levodovich took UR Delver all the way to the, or Blue Red Delver all the way to the finals and ended up losing to Ari Lax on Death and Taxes. And Ari Lax actually just top eighted a Legacy Championship in the most recent Eternal Weekend, some 11 years later after this one. So, very cool.
Yeah, super cool. Osip had, I can't pull the deck list up here for some reason, but Osip had a couple Grim Lavamancers in his deck at the time, which I thought was pretty cool to kind of fight the low creature stuff, but it wasn't good enough. Ari finally got him in the finals. So I'll have to ask Ari if I see him again next year at Eternal Weekend, if he remembers anything from that match, because I don't, there's no coverage or anything that I could find. So, but it's kind of cool to see like, Death and Taxes, kind of similar to Delver, has been a staple of Legacy since the beginning, and these two decks kind of sparring off in the finals is a pretty cool way to start off Eternal Weekend. The other thing I noted is that there were two other Rug Delver decks, like your traditional Stifle Canadian Threshold style decks, also in the top eight. So three total Delver decks in the first Eternal Weekend top eight that I could find.
Yeah, it's also interesting. This is a little off topic, but this conversation seems to come up, at least in our like more public Discord, a couple times a year where folks are always like, look, I found some budget for a legacy deck. However, I don't really want to have to buy another legacy deck for quite some time, or, I want something that can just sit on the shelf and age like fine wine. What do I buy, basically? We always see this conversation pop up. And, when you look at this history that we're talking about, we're looking at the first Eternal Weekend that we could find on record having two different types of Delver decks in top eight. As we keep moving forward, you're also going to see about 20 different other versions of Delver, including ones that include like Death Shadow and things like that. And it's like the way I always answer the question is buy the core of the Delver deck and then just fill it in with the $10 or $20 new printing cards that may come in and become powerful enough, like Psychic Frogs, for example. If you had kept a blue red Delver deck from 2013 with maybe a few $100s, you would have a completely up to date 2024 list going into Eternal Weekend of last year.
Like most of these variants that we're going to go over today, I played almost all of them, and in my core purchases of my Dazes and Force of Wills and Ponders and Brainstorms and Blue Dual Lands like have carried me for 12 or 13 years in the format. So, I mean, that's exactly 100% true.
Yeah, it's easy on the budget. I mean, you make that investment up front and you have a powerful deck for life. You may have to buy the occasional dual land here and there, but I largely think folks that can afford them aren't super upset by purchasing extra dual lands.
Yep. So moving forward from Eternal Weekend 2013, I didn't see anything major happen in the format for the majority of 2014 until the release of Khans of Tarkir, which introduced the reintroduction of the Delve mechanic and brought us the lovely blue spells of Treasure Cruise and Dig Through Time. I'm sure people are familiar with those, but we're still playing them today in Pioneer, amazingly. It's amazing how much more balanced those cards are without fetch lands in the format.
It also brought Hootie, right?
Yep. We'll see Hooting Mandrills make an appearance kind of later down here in the timeline, but it brought Hooting Mandrills, and then later on in the block we get Gurmag Angler in January. But the very first kind of like Treasure Cruise Delver deck. The reason this one is really kind of sticks out in history for me is it's the first time that the Delver deck has had true card advantage, right? In all of these other Delver decks, like everything's either a 1-for-1 or a cantrip or a Force of Will. That's a 1-for-2 basically. So this is the first time in Delver's history where you get to play a bunch of spells and then all of a sudden, pay 1 blue mana and draw 3 cards. And it really completely dominated. I can't remember what open it was, but we were at the time it was the SCG Open, the first Open that Treasure Cruise was legal. Bob Wong won the event with Blue Red Delver. And then the following month in October of 2014, Kevin Jones takes the Blue Red Treasure Cruise Delver deck and wins Eternal Weekend. Any thoughts
Yeah,
on Kevin's deck?
I'm just looking at this and like honestly, it is just overpowered, especially if some of these cards were legal today too. Because like the threat suite is very simple. It's 4 Delver of Secrets, 4 Young Pyromancer, and 4 Monastery Swiftspear, and then the deck effectively operates like a prowess deck from there. So it's just all how can we trigger Swiftspear, how can we make more tokens with Young Pyromancer, and then you also have 4 Gitaxian Probe to support going turn 2 Young Pyromancer, probe you, make a token. So just instant value there for effectively the cost of 2 mana. And then the 4 Treasure Cruise, like you mentioned too, because this deck is just going to turn through cards lightning quick.
Yeah, it was kind of crazy at the time. It really felt like a whole huge step above everything else. And honestly, it didn't last long. So Kevin wins in October of 2014. January of 2015, the next BNR, they banned Treasure Cruise. So that really kind of eliminates the blue-red Treasure Cruise Delver deck. But at the same time, they left Dig Through Time legal, which everyone thought was kind of an interesting choice. And at that same time, Fate Reforged was printed, so Gurmag Angler became the delve card that you were kind of able to play in these delver decks. And it was kind of a fun time because you again had this like mix and match of delver decks where the 1-drops remained Deathrite Shaman and Delver, but you could play bug colors for like Abrupt Decay and stuff like that, or you could play Grixis Delver, which is kind of what the format ended up kind of evolving into, where you have the combination of a couple of Gurmag Anglers and a couple of Dig Through Times. So still a total of 4 Delve spells, but like a mix and match between Gurmag and Dig Through Time. But then we kind of figured out at the time that as long as you're going to play black for Gurmag Angler, you might as well play Cabal Therapy as well, right? Because Gitaxian Probe remains legal. And if you've ever played with Young Pyromancer, Gitaxian Probe, and Cabal Therapy, it feels extremely unfair.
Yeah, I can definitely see that. And that's all reflected too in the older coverage if you are able to find some of these. Because I mean, largely a lot of what we're talking about here you can find on YouTube and go back and watch. And that's something that I've done as I've navigated through Legacy and trying to learn as much as I can about the Delver deck and the history of Delver. It's really interesting to me because we're talking about how it used to be Bug and it used to be Grixis, but not too long after that, why not both?
Yeah, as we get to Eternal Weekend in 2015 in August, we do see some people spreading into a 4-color. So some people simply played 1 tropical island only to activate the gain life mode from Deathrite Shaman, or occasionally like a sideboard card like Ancient Grudge. And then some people went all the way and decided just to play Abrupt Decay as their removal spell of choice in the main deck. So this was kind of a fun time to be playing Delver because A, it was very good in the format, and B, there was like 2 or 3 different ways that you could build it that kind of all had their pros and cons based on the different matchups.
Yeah, I also assume that you are largely priced into playing Abrupt Decay because it kills Counterbalance. It's like the cleanest answer to Counterbalance.
Yep, 100%. Counterbalance and Terminus and Sensei's Divining Top were the other blue pillars of the format at the time. So if you couldn't get Counterbalance off the table, you were in big trouble. Like, I always felt like the Delver deck was kind of at a slight disadvantage against the good Miracles pilots, but the games were always really good and really tight and really back and forth. And again, if you go back and watch coverage, there's a ton of this where you can watch Reed Duke playing Miracles against some of the top Delver players of the time, and it's always a pretty fun scrap. But why don't you tell us about 2015 Eternal Weekend here, since we got to the end of this era?
Yeah, looking at Bob Huang's list here. So Bob played that four color. I want to call it Delver, but it really is just like four color good stuff featuring the Delver core. We're looking at four Deathrite, four Delver, two Gurmag, three Snapcaster Mage, which is just interesting to me looking at the mana base. Two True Name Nemesis, which you've already highlighted as like sort of a scourge of the format, at least this early on. Then we have the three Abrupt Decay. So it looks like Jarvis did a really good job of hedging against miracles, especially when we see three Abrupt Decay and three Spell Pierce. Because I imagine Spell Pierce was probably one of the cleanest ways to return serve to the miracles deck when you didn't have like a Daze or Force of Will for their counterbalance.
Yeah, so you can kind of see here in 2015 and 2016, like not that much changes. So in August of 2015, Bob Wong wins with Grixis Delver, but there's also four color Delvers in the top eight. And then the next year, Jarvis, you top eight's 2016 Eternal Weekend with four color Delver. And there's no bans in Legacy at all in 2016. So like it's a pretty stable format. And we have this blue fair deck of like Deathrite Shaman in one aisle and Miracles decks in the other aisle kind of fighting each other. And it goes on for at least 18 months. But a lot of people point to this as being a really healthy point in Legacy, even though I would argue that Sensei's Divining Top was kind of an unfun Magic card to play against, especially when you had inexperienced pilots that just took forever. The only issue I would say with the format at this time is that the rounds oftentimes went really long. And when you got, big, 1,500 person Grand Prix and stuff, each of the rounds would go at least an hour and 10 minutes or an hour and 20 minutes. So it was a problem at the time.
It's also just funny to look at this timeline where it says Jarvis Yu top eight's Eternal Weekend with four color Delver, and then like 6 months later we see Sensei's Divining Top banned. Like that's just really interesting to me because I can imagine the Miracles matchup being largely in Miracles' favor over Delver, but it sounds like to me, you obviously had the experience there that it's not entirely unwinnable.
It's not unwinnable, and the Miracles decks didn't have great matchups into a lot of the combo decks that were faster, the Stompy decks. So like there was a rock, paper, scissors of like Delver on one side, Miracles on the other, and then kind of like the non-blue, like Stompy and unfair stuff that the Miracles decks could struggle with. So it really was a kind of a nice balance there. But actually, I think talking about the Sensei's Divining Top ban, which happened in April of 2017, is pretty interesting because I didn't go back and read it, but my recollection is that they actually banned the card based on play patterns and not power level specifically. They basically said that like the rounds are taking too long and it's not very fun to like sit there and watch your opponent spin the top over and over and over and over again. So they kind of just eliminated it from the format. And it had probably been the quote unquote best deck in Legacy for a long time, to where if you made it to the top eight and there was a bunch of other blue decks in the top eight, you were a pretty good, favorite to beat the Delver decks. But the problem was kind of getting there. But my recollection is really the sentiment from Wizards at the time was really more about play patterns and tournament logistics than it was about raw power level.
Interesting. So do you think that in a world where every Magic player can finish their round on time, do you think Sensei's Divining Top belongs back in Legacy?
I mean, it's certainly possible. I don't wish for that, but I don't think it's like too egregious of a card by itself. Like, obviously, it's very good with counterbalance, but I would argue in 2025, we have plenty of answers to counterbalance. There's a million cards have been printed, some of which we'll talk about later in the timeline. So I don't think counterbalance is the problem that it used to be. And you probably could bring back Divining Top based on power level, but why? I don't think we need anything that would slow down tournaments.
Fair enough. Fair enough. I am curious, to sort of take another matchup approach by 2017, because I have no idea, looking at these four color or even three color Delver decks, how they ever beat lands. Can you talk to me a little bit about what that matchup looked like, and was it better or was it worse than it is now? Because honestly, I feel like Delver has more tools to defeat lands than it ever has.
Well, I will tell you, True Name Nemesis is pretty good against lands. So that's kind of how that went. Like you could figure out how to land a True Name or you couldn't. The other side of it is it's the same thing that it always is. You try to land a couple of little one drops. You keep all the lightning bolts in your deck, and you side in Price of Progress. So those were really the two ways to do it.
Interesting. So what about these like four color bug style decks that are playing like abrupt decays and snapcaster mages rather than like a lot of the low to the ground red creatures? Is it really just true name nemesis or bust?
Well, basically, Deathrite Shaman gives you this angle where you don't have to attack to do damage. So if you could have Deathrite on the table, it's 2 damage every turn.
Interesting. Okay. Cool. I just still don't really see how we're beating a Merit Lage, but I guess the goal is to just wasteland them off of it and pray.
Yeah, it was never a good matchup. Like it was definitely a bad matchup, and I think specifically if you played the Bug Delver deck that we'll see here at Eternal Weekend in 2017 in the hands of Hans Jakob Godek, which is HJ Kaiser online, one of the just goats of Legacy. Like I'm pretty sure he's trying to dodge lands, like 100%.
Yeah, I'm looking at this list now, actually, if you want to go ahead and pull it up. We see some of the things that you talked about previously, like Tombstalker, Sylvan Library, Liliana the Last Hope, which is just not great against lands from what I gather. There's nothing really to target. You're just picking up creatures and then probably sideboarding it out in games 2 and 3. 4 Hymn to Torok. I love seeing 4 Hymn to Torok over 3 Ponder. That's just hilarious to me. That's great deck building.
Yeah, actually, so this is an interesting year, 2017. There are 5 total Delver decks in the Eternal Weekend top 8. We have Brian Koval playing the 4-color, kind of Delver pile with the sideboard Ancient Grudge and a couple other interesting things. We have Bob Wong again in the top 8 with Grixis Delver. And then we have Eric Virgo. And I didn't look this up, but I believe this is the year that Eric Virgo top-8'd both Vintage and Legacy in the same year. And Eric's here playing, 4 Stifle Rug Delver with Hooting Mandrills in the top 8. So this is the real heyday for Delver.
Yeah, we got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 different lists. We got UR, we got Grixis, 4-color, Grixis, and then Bugs. So the only really repeating Delver list is Grixis. Which is just cool to see. I mean, very rarely, if ever, will you see like an overwhelmingly powerful deck that has so many different ways to build it in the top 8. Like we talk a lot about Modern, and like the Nadu decks weren't all that different from each other. The Breach decks weren't all that different from each other. But when you come over to Legacy and we look at 2017, which in reality is not that long ago, we're seeing 4 different types of Delver decks being successful.
Yep.
So that also sort of makes it difficult for WotC to figure out what to do. It's like, how do we check this deck? And I think a lot of the time, outside of the egregious 2-drops that we'll talk about have been banned over the course of many years, there really isn't much that they can do to the shell that makes any sense.
Well, so I lived in Los Angeles at the time and was playing a bunch of Legacy kind of locally in LA. And it was kind of fun because like you see here in the top 8, I could literally show up with a different variant of Delver every week. So no one really knew exactly what you were playing, which was really fun. I do recall the only like truly horrendous matchup was the Check Pile 4-color control deck that you can see Andre Strosky here played in the top 8. And if you look at this deck list now, it is like Baleful Strix, Snapcaster Mage, Jace the Mind Sculptor, and just the most gigantic pile of removal that you could ever imagine. I just remember like every time he got paired into this deck, you're like, oh my God, it felt unwinnable. It was just brutal.
Yeah, that's funny. That's funny. Cool. So that's October of 2017 when Hans Jakob Godek wins with Bug Delver. We don't get any major changes to Legacy for almost a year, when in July of 2018, Cataxian Probe and Deathrite Shaman, who are 2 cards that largely represented what Delver looked like at the time and all of its different variants, were banned.
This is one of the Legacy BNRs I remember that like shocked the world, because if you go back, if you look at like MTG Top 8 basically, and you look at the decks from before this ban announcement, let's say June of 2018, Deathrite Shaman is literally everywhere. They're playing it in Elves. They're playing it in every single deck that could cast the Deathrite Shaman was playing it. So when this ban happened, it fundamentally changed the format severely. And you have to remember, this is July of 2018. This is 6 years after Deathrite Shaman was printed in 2012 and returned to Ravnica. So, like, for this entire 6 year period, Deathrite Shaman really defined what Legacy was about. So, this to me is like a fundamental shift in the timeline, a fork in the timeline where Legacy kind of changes forever.
Yeah, and I think a lot of Delver players had to go back to the drawing board too because they couldn't rely on a one mana planeswalker and then a free, probing into your opponent's hand and knowing exactly what they're doing at all times. I think a lot of folks probably had to get better in that moment because they didn't have free information and they didn't have a do it all type of creature. And the interesting part to me too is, Delver still stayed at the top of the metagame because 1 month after that banning, the Channel Fireball team got together and Josh Utter Layton crushed with a Death Shadow Delver variant. So, do you want to highlight, I guess, the key differences between traditional Delver and then what we see in this Death Shadow deck?
Well, I just want to take a moment to talk about PT25. So this was a tournament that they ran, a pro tour. It was a team pro tour, which is the only one in my memory that we've ever had. And it was a 3 format team event. So you played Legacy, Modern, and maybe it was Standard. God, I can't remember. It's been so long. But it was the first time that, since I had become a competitive player, that they had Legacy on the pro tour stage. And it was also a pretty exciting time, right? Because they had just banned Deathrite Shaman the month before, and like everything was brand new. Josh's deck was the first time we had ever seen Death Shadow in a Legacy tempo deck. So he played cards like Snuff Out, Thoughtseize, Stubborn Denial, and then a bunch of low to the ground threats like Gurmag Angler and Delver and Death Shadow. And then honestly, I played this deck and it was awesome. It was super fun to play. It was really a combo killer. Like if you got paired into a combo deck, it was just like lights out. You just had so much disruption with Force of Will, Thoughtseize, Daze, and a fast clock. But the problem was that anybody that showed up with Death and Taxes or a Swords to Plowshares deck was a miserable matchup. So if you look at Josh's deck, he had 3 Dread of Night in his sideboard, specifically because he knew that the Death and Taxes matchup was abysmal. And he ends up losing to Alan Wu, who piloted the Death and Taxes deck just beautifully. If you can go back and find the content to watch PT25 finals, Josh kind of just gets picked apart by Alan. And Alan is just an amazing Death and Taxes and Control pilot in general. But even through 3 Dread of Nights, Alan pulls it out and they end up winning the team PT. So I remember when this aired, it was a huge deal. All the people that were in my play group at the time, living in LA, we all got together and went over to my buddy's house and watched the top 8 of the Pro Tour on the big screen TV as a big group event. And it was just awesome to see the best players in the world play Legacy because we'd never seen that before on the Pro Tour stage and we never have since.
Yeah, I mean, I hope that that's something that they'd bring back. It doesn't sound really like they will, but I think that was definitely one of those ripples in time that, we have that time capsule on YouTube where we can go back and watch this deck just totally smash the PT when, I think a lot of folks were largely scrambling to figure out what to do. And real quick, could you just let the listener know what Dread of Night does?
Dread of Night, 1 black enchantment. White creatures get -1/-1.
By listener, I meant me, because I have no idea what that card does. But that's actually hilarious. It's just basically a Death and Taxes Plague Engineer.
Yeah, exactly. A 1 black enchantment Plague Engineer for your opponent's entire deck. And Alan still found a way to win.
Very cool.
Yeah.
Cool. Well, I know. So we had that PT in August, and then October rolls around, and we sort of fall flat. There's no Delver in top 8 of this Eternal weekend, and it's capped off by something that always puts a smile on my face is seeing Ad Nauseam Tendrils. I believe it was 2 episodes ago, Lee, where you said that card was uncastable. I'm not gonna let you forget that. So, and this is by Cyrus Corman Gill. I know you have some personal stories regarding this player.
Yeah, that's what Cyrus knocked me out. I'm pretty sure I told the story from GP Atlanta. So playing Ad Nauseam Tendril. So he is just an absolute master of this deck. But spoiler alert, this is the only set of results from Eternal Weekend that I found that did not have a Delver deck in the top 8. So.
And notably, too, I'm not sure if this is the most accurate thing, but I will say what I found the other day. Card Titan released the footage for this Eternal Weekend like 2 weeks ago. I remember I pinged the Discord and said like, "Hey, I was just on my YouTube feed and like it just dropped all the Eternal Weekend 2018 coverage in my timeline." And I was like, "Oh, this is a cool flashback." And then I looked and the posting date was like, or I guess it was like 18 hours ago or something. I'm like, "Huh. I wonder if this was never published or never posted," but you can actually go back and watch this event too. And Cyrus Corman Gill's Ant deck is just absolutely gorgeous. Like beta everything, foil everything, just totally beautiful.
Yep. The Delver decks kind of just struggled in this entire era because there were no good threats. Like there just weren't enough good cards to kill your opponent at the time. And, you know, when Death Rat Shaman left the format, we were just kind of lacking for something besides Delver of Secrets and Tourney Nemesis to do. There were no good red cards to play, and like nothing kind of went on. And as I was like searching through all the results to make this timeline, there just weren't that many Delver decks in the top of any of the events until we get to March of the following year. So March of 2019, I recall this. I was kind of excited because Rich Calley, who's a upstate New York native, won SCG Syracuse with 4 Terramander in his deck, which is a really awful creature. I'd have to look. I don't have it pulled up. Do you?
I don't. I think it's, if I remember correctly, it's like a blue for a 1/1, and then you have the ability to adapt it and turn it into like a 4/4 flyer.
Yeah, but it's like real expensive. So it's adapt for 7 and a blue, and it costs 1 less for each instant and sorcery in your graveyard, and it becomes a 5/5 flyer. So
Okay.
you
Not
can
too
just
bad for the
tell
top of the noggin.
they're yeah, exactly, but they're digging deep into the into the card pool to like try to find something competitive to play. But Rich is just an amazing player and kind of got it done. This was a bit of a meme at the time, I recall, in all the commentary, and Rich kind of, you know, eventually kind of said like, look, Terramander like wasn't that important. Like I won the deck based on the other good cards, and I pitched it to Force of Will a whole bunch, but like it filled a hole in the deck list that he needed.
Yeah, yeah. Are you talking about when Dreadhorde was printed?
Well, yeah, I mean, 2 months later in May, Dreadhorde Arcanist is printed, right? So then you're like, okay, now we have threats again. And then we get a 1/2 hit, right? Because in May, I think this is actually a really important time in Magic. This is like another fork in the road. This is when the fire philosophy card design begins. So we get Dreadhorde Arcanist in May. We get Modern Horizons 1 in June of 2019, which includes Renin 6 that we'll talk about here in a minute. And then the next set right after that in October, we get Throne of Eldraine with Oko. So, I mean, all of these cards are just totally bananas compared to anything we had, you know, prior to that.
Oko wasn't even the best card printed in Throne of Eldraine.
I mean, I know it has your favorite card in Magic. I was going to let you talk about that.
Yeah, we also got Brazen Borrower, which I know I highlighted the lands matchup, but Brazen Borrower has been a 2-copy staple in basically every Delver deck that I've played. And anytime Lee sends me a Delver deck and is like, "Oh, what do you think of this?" And I'm like, "It only has 1 Brazen Borrower, so it's wrong." Yeah, jokes aside though, Dreadhorde plus MH1 plus Oko and Uro and all of the other nonsense that came out of Thrones was definitely a pivot point where it's like it felt like Delver sort of had its power stripped away for a little bit, a very short timeline, but then it was immediately snapped back into action when you have a 1/3 trampler that, you know, when you swing you get to brainstorm again.
Man, that card was so fun to play with. This must be right here in the timeline where I play Cyrus at GP Atlanta, and I just recall having Dreadhorde and Renin 6 in my deck, and like it was just amazing. Like you really could not lose the fair matchups. Like you just had so much card advantage. You could pick up your Wastelands every turn to Wasteland lock people out of the game. You could ponder. You could, you know, throw bolts six damage at a time, bolt their face, swing, bolt them again. Like this is really, to me, was like the most powerful fair version of Delver, where, you know, if you were playing against an opposing Ponder Force of Will deck, it felt like you were super far ahead, and your only real thorn in your side was somebody like Cyrus throwing up with Ad Nauseam Tendrils.
And so, correct me if I'm wrong, so there was definitely an event where you had Dreadhorde, Renin 6, Oko, and Dig Through Time. Do I have that correct?
I don't think so. Did I miss the Dig Through Time? No, Dig Through Time was banned here way back in 2015. It didn't last that long.
Okay. Gotcha. Okay, that's just my oversight. I mean, you still have Dreadhorde, Ren and Six, and Oko in a freaking Delver deck all at once. I mean, that's just absolutely off the rails. That sounds like a lot of fun, honestly. I think if we ever got bored one day, we should put those decks together and play those mirrors. I think that'd be a ton of fun.
Yeah, I mean, just take a look at the deck that won Eternal Weekend the same year. So November of 2019, Tom Hertfelder wins, and he's playing. I mean, they're calling it Canadian Threshold, but if you look at the results, again, one, two, three, four, five Delver decks in the Eternal Weekend top eight, and his threat suite for this particular tournament: four Delver of Secrets, three Hooting Mandrills, three Tarmogoyf, two True Name Nemesis, and three Ren and Six. So like this deck was just extremely resilient and very powerful. Honestly, this deck was a lot of fun to play, but it just really felt oppressive to a lot of people because just recurring Wasteland every turn is just totally brutal. He even has a waterlogged Grove in his mana base so that he can cycle his land and pick it back up every turn.
Yeah, I love that. It also looks like Tom was an early adopter of Force of Negation. And at the beginning, we talked in the primer about all these free interaction spells, Force of Will, Daze. How did Force of Negation impact Legacy and the Delver deck at the time? Because it's interesting to see how early this was adopted here.
Well, I mean, Force of Will was always a card that in a bunch of matchups you would mulligan to. So whether you're playing Ad Nauseam or Sneak and Show or whatever, like it was just when you played the Delver deck, you basically had to mulligan to Force of Will. So what the discussion at the time was like, look, if we put six forces in our deck, we simply allow ourselves to keep more hands, and it made the deck even more consistent. So it really wasn't about power level, it was about upping the consistency of the deck and allowing it to keep more 7-card hands.
And so I guess what's changed between then and now to where we don't feel the need to be playing six forces in the main?
I would say that like the creatures have become more powerful in aggregate over the last 6 years comparative to the spells. So there's just way more, creature spells that get put on the stack, whether it's the initiative creatures coming up later or any of the other more powerful stuff where like, in this era of Legacy, it was very rare for your opponent to resolve a creature that would win the game on its own. The broadside bombardiers and the like had not been printed, so I think that's really the main difference.
Sure. Okay. Well, this deck was pretty short-lived because, right after Tom won, Red and Six got banned, which sounds like that was just a must-do. It's another one of those cards that's just in the long list of overpowered 2-drops that have been banned in Legacy.
One of the things that I noticed about putting together this timeline is the major changes to Legacy almost always happened after Eternal Weekend. So it looks like this is kind of part of Wizards' cycle to say, hey, let's look at the culmination of the year. Let's use Eternal Weekend as like the crowning point of Legacy for the thing. And then we're going to make fundamental changes if something's out of line. And this year is no different. So, I mean, Ren and Six had to go. It was just like, it's no fun for your opponent to get wastelanded every turn. I mean, there are some people who love to cast Life from the Loam. Like you and I played Legacy this last week locally, and I played against Josh, and he Life from the Loamed me every single turn and kept wastelanding me. And like I'll tell you, like it's not that fun, So they tried to remove it from the format, at least from the blue decks.
Yeah, agreed. And then, we have this short blurb about the printing of Luris in April of 2020. I guess that's kind of a gap, November 2019 to April of 2020, but Luris is printed, Zerta is printed, and then they're both just snap banned the month after. I guess this might be a dumb question, but why was Zerta banned so quickly? Because I know it goes infinite with Grim Monolith, but what were people playing that got it banned so quick?
Yeah, well, first off, this is a really weird time because it's the very beginning of the pandemic and everyone's locked in their house. It's April of 2020, right? But the Zerta cards just went infinite with a bunch of artifact stuff, and I just, it seemed too busted at the time. You have to remember when they banned these cards, it was the original Commander rules. You could literally just pay 3 mana and put it on the table. So it was like totally ridiculous.
Yeah, I mean, that makes sense. Maybe Luris brought a pandemic upon us when it was printed, so I could believe that. I didn't, again, play in that timeline, but I'm sort of glad I didn't. I can't imagine what Luris would do in Legacy today. You also highlighted a few other things that have been running rampant in this era, too. We have Uro. I remember the Bant Uro deck with, the best removal, the Uro package, I guess, when you could loop it with Karakas and, just get so far. I know that deck was sort of a bane of Delver's existence for quite a while because it was just such a strong matchup.
Yeah, this kind of almost felt like a return to the check pile decks where like at this point in the timeline, the Swords to Plowshares gamers get to play Uro, they get to play Oko, they get to play Arkham's Astrolabe, they played Ice Fang Coatl, and then at the end of this whole thing, Tom White McWinsauce puts Yorion in this deck, and you just get into this like huge, grindy, unwinnable pile of cards, and I found it relatively miserable at the time, and it went on for a long time. Like I have May 2020 is when this really started to pick up, and then it's not till February of 21 that we get a major shakeup in Legacy. So that's almost the 9 months of time basically. And in February 21, we get Dreadhorde, Oko, and Astrolabe banned. So this was again like a major reset to the format.
Yeah, and do you think Astrolabe mostly got banned because it was blanking Wasteland? Because most of the decks would just play Snow Basics, and then the Delver deck lost an edge by being able to Wasteland the opponent out of the game?
Maybe. I just think every deck turned into 5-color soup and it was just kind of dumb. Wizards doesn't really like when the color pie is fundamentally broken, and Astrolabe does that immediately. So I just think they wanted the colors to retain their identity in the format.
Got it. Okay. Well, April 2021, we got Strixhaven, so Expressive Iteration was then printed, and this is actually where my Legacy timeline begins. I didn't start with Delver, but we don't have to go into some of the garbage that I was playing before I really got involved in Legacy, but Expressive Iteration, another one of those 2-drops that ultimately ended up getting banned, which I thought was a little on the line. I did get to play Expressive Iteration and Delver, and it obviously was a fantastic Magic card, but it wasn't a Magic card that you really got to play until turn 3 most of the time. Or I guess I should rephrase that. You wouldn't really get to play it until you had a land drop to get +2 lands in play, because what you really like to do with your Expressive is grab a creature, grab a land, or maybe grab an interactive spell, grab a land, or something to just keep you moving forward. Because grabbing a land also allowed you to grab Mystic Sanctuary to recycle it.
Yeah, and these Delver decks are kind of boring. They kind of use the same justification they did when they banned Treasure Cruise and Dig Through Time and stuff. Like when you give the Delver deck a 1 or 2 mana card advantage spell, it seems to put itself above the rest of the format. And I'm with you. I think it's a little marginal on power level, honestly, for a ban, but I'm glad that it's gone because, as I mentioned on previous episode, it's just super repetitive gameplay over and over and iteration into iteration into buyback iteration. Like it's just not that fun. So I'm glad to see it go, honestly. But this is just the beginning of the crazy time, because why don't you tell the listeners what happens in June of 21, just a couple months later?
Well, we all saw kind of the disaster that was Modern Horizons 1 on Legacy. They basically doubled down with MH2 and replaced most of the MH1 cards with all of these now more busted MH2 cards. So we're furthering the Fire Design era by providing cards like Ragavan, Dragon's Rage Channeler, Murktide Regent, Unholy Heat, Prismatic Ending in some of the Jeskai versions, and then even Urza's Saga found its way into Delver at times because Ragavan would just make treasures, and then treasures make constructs, and treasures grow constructs, and it was just a total mess, and it was a cluster of just overpowered Magic cards. And I even remember too, it sounds ridiculous to say this today, but there was a call for Murktide to get banned at one point because just on rate, a 2-mana 8/8 flyer that was blue, it was just unbelievably powerful at the time.
Yeah, you're bringing Ragavan and Murktide into the fold. So it was not that long ago. So this is 21. It was in 2019 we were talking about, early 2019. There were literally no threats to play in the Delver deck. Like they were all terrible. Now they just printed 3 cards that you could legitimately just stick 4 of in your deck, and including Urza Saga is kind of another threat too. Like this is when I was playing this exact shell of Ragavan, DRC, Murktide, and even Saga at the time, and like, man, it was amazing. It felt like your threats in the deck were just way ahead of what everybody else could do, and I think it was kind of, it stayed there for a while, right? That we got these printed in June. If you fast forward to Eternal Weekend 2021, They didn't do an in-person event. They held online events. They had a couple online events, and this is where you see Stefan Schutz go 9-0, and one of the other events as well, another 8-1 or 9-0 with basically MH2 block constructed Delver. What are your thoughts on Stefan's deck here?
I mean, it's just craziness, and it's funny to me because Stefan's actually playing Delver of Secrets. There were a lot of versions of the deck that didn't even play Delver because it had been power crept out so hard by DRC and Ragavan and Murktide. So you were more incentivized to want to just play a DRC or a Ragavan on turn one than like ever playing a Delver on turn one. And the adaptation of Gut Shot. So Gut Shot is a one red Phyrexian mana, deal one damage to any target. This was a gut reaction, pun intended, to Ragavan because Ragavan was just such a nightmare. Turn one, play Ragavan, hold up Daze. Well, it like brings back just awful memories of me trying to be learning how to play Legacy in this format and getting hit by Ragavans and having like my cantrips casted off the top of my library. It was awful.
Yep. So you get all the busted MH2 threats and 4 expressive iteration in your deck to go find them. I mean, it was quite a time.
He wasn't even playing Mystic Sanctuary. That tech hadn't even been found yet, but it didn't matter. Like, he's playing 2 Steam Vents, and one of those could have easily been a Mystic Sanctuary, but, this was sort of the early adoption of the new Izzet Delver deck from MH2, and I totally agree with you that this is most definitely a block constructed MH2 deck.
Yep. So we see the same pattern again. 2021 Eternal Weekend won by Delver. Next BNR announcement in January 2022, Ragavan is banned. And I think many people were thrilled with this change, and I think it's probably reasonable. I think Ragavan is a pretty good power level for Modern, but in a Days Wasteland format, it gets out of line pretty quick.
Yep, agreed. And then Jay, like towards the end of 2022, our friend of the pod, Jay Wojciechowski, or Jay Where's Your House Key, as he's known on Facebook, wins Eternal Weekend with Blue Red Delver anyway. A lot of folks thought that with the death of Ragavan that this deck was, going to struggle, and it just didn't. It just maximizes on copies of Delver. Jay also included copies of Fury because at the time, the best deck in the format was actually the White Initiative deck. It was newer to the scene, and it was just way overpowered to the point where it was one of the fastest decks that also had the best prison pieces that also kept combo out of the metagame. So we ended up with this format where we had the White Initiative deck, and then the only deck that could actually combat it was the Delver deck. So those were really the only 2 decks to be playing at this tournament, and Jay recognized that and adopted Fury because Fury is a free way to kill their initiative creature and then attack in with your 1/1 Delver. So you don't even need it to flip to completely change the texture of the game. And I think that that's why, Jay was super successful here in this event. He also was playing 4 Expressive Iteration, 2 Brazen Borrower, Unholy Heat. This one adopted Mystic Sanctuary, as I think Mystic Sanctuary had been pretty stock at this point. We hit, this point in the metagame. But Ragavan took it way over the top, but it still was just the best thing to be doing even with the ban of that.
The other thing I thought was interesting about Jay's deck at the time was he included a copy of Steam Vents in the mana base just because he wanted, more blue-red duels to play his red 1-drops and stuff. So I just thought it was kind of interesting that he put Steam Vents in his deck. It's not something I would have got to, but I think it was good for him at the time.
Yeah, and it was also a heads up for him to cut a Wasteland because the colors mattered more than taking the White Initiative deck off of a mana because half the deck was made of mana. The other half of the deck was made of, absolute haymakers in the form of prison pieces and or creatures. So, when you realize that wastelanding an ancient tomb after they've played a White Plume adventure is not what you want to be doing, you probably are better served by adding a little bit more color to your mana base.
For sure. Cutting a Wasteland, adding a Steam Vents was blew my mind at the time, but in retrospect, it definitely looks correct.
It's so funny that these small changes are the ones that geek us out a little bit, but they are really huge when you look at, the meta at scale. And then, so that was November of 2022. I picked up Delver right after this event because, I went into Eternal Weekend trying to play Storm, and it was just basically unplayable against the best deck because it had Thalia, Archon of Emeria, it had a fast clock, and then it also had Chalice of the Void and Anointed Peacekeeper. I mean, it's basically just mono combo cards don't work deck. it was impossible to be playing combo against those decks, unfortunately. But I pivoted to 8 cast for that event and got promptly exited by White Plume Adventurer, and then decided that I needed to pick up Delver because I needed to have always a solid plan B. And Delver for me at the time was a plan B that's now turned into more of a plan A for me.
Yep. So the ban cycle continues. Jay wins over the White Plume Adventurers, and in March of 23, we ban Expressive Iteration and we ban White Plume Adventurer to, I think, the joy of everyone. Because, like, turn 1 White Plume Adventurer is, like, the most miserable thing to play against.
Yep. And we also had a team event here locally in Denver. It was the last time I ever cast an Expressive Iteration. I was playing in the Legacy seat. And the team that actually won, I believe it was Aaron Mint and Paul Green's team. They were Team Initiative, were all 3 players. This was also an Eternal team event. So it was Vintage, Legacy, and Pauper. So all 3 of the members of the team got to play some form of white initiative creature. So they were Team Initiative. And then they also took that team event down, just to show you how dominant White Plume Adventure was.
Yeah, shocking. Paul Green plays the best deck with his team and they crush everybody.
Definitely. Yeah, after EI and White Plume Adventure were banned, I thought we actually went into a state where Legacy was actually really, really good. Like, the playing field seemed very level. The Delver decks had to go back to playing a smaller game, playing small ball with Wastelands, Dazes, and Force of Wills, rather than playing for value Expressive Iterations and Mystic Sanctuaries and more of a longer or mid-range game. They had to go back to being more identified as a tempo deck. Then I also think everything else sort of had a chance to play catch-up after being locked in a closet during the Initiative era. But then we got hit with what I would refer to as Modern Horizons 3, the true Modern Horizons 3, and that being Lord of the Rings.
It's funny because when the One Ring was previewed, everyone looked at it, and then but it was like way before the set released, and like everyone kind of forgot about it by the time it came out, and it took a while for everyone to kind of figure out how busted the One Ring was in Legacy, and I would argue that it's still one of the most egregious cards in the format, but the card that really warped the format immediately was Orcish Bowmasters. I remember you and I can still remember this to this day. You and I went to Mythic. We both had our play sets of Bowmasters and we played a bunch of Grixis Delver mirrors and stuff. And you fundamentally had to change all of your heuristics about when you play Ponder and when you play Brainstorm and what you have to fight over or whatever. Orcish Bowmasters, I think, changed the Legacy format in a way that I don't think you could really anticipate just looking at the card and reading it for the first time.
Yep, agreed. This is also where Javier's article about cantripping sort of got thrown out of the window, for lack of a better term, at least while Orcish Bowmasters got up to, and I believe it peaked at 51% of the meta had some amount of Orcish Bowmasters in their deck, which is just unfathomable at the time. And a lot of folks were calling for it to get banned, like emergency ban, get the card out of here. And, I actually never really thought the card was ban worthy. I thought that it was a raise the alarm that punished cantrips, and that's pretty much exactly what the card is. And we still see it in pretty decent quantities, but it's not as overbearing nearly as it, it's not as overbearing now as it was then. Until we had the realization that you could be combining it with Grief, Reanimate, and Entomb.
Well, so you're getting ahead of yourself a little bit. So in the middle of 23, we played a bunch of Grixis Delver with Orcish Bowmasters. That was kind of the best deck in the format. And it wasn't until September of that same year that the Grief scam decks really kind of made their appearance. And what this really did was it took the blue-black core and it added Grief and Reanimate in the Delver slots. So this really isn't a Delver deck in a lot of ways. This kind of gets away from the quote-unquote Delver archetype, but it's still a blue-black tempo deck that plays Daze, Wasteland, Force of Will, but you just moved your 1-drop to Reanimate and then took all their cards with Grief. So that, this was like the hotness that was like leading up to Eternal Weekend of 2023. These Grief scam decks were kind of everywhere, and they got me too. Like, as soon as this deck came out, I played it immediately and really, really liked it. Did you play any of this scam deck? I don't think you did you?
No, I was too busy beating you guys to death with Grist under Agatha's Soul Cauldron during this timeline.
Oh, yeah, that makes sense.
I played, for the listener, I basically played the anti-meta blue deck. It was a Agatha's Soul Cauldron, Gaia's Cradle, Cradle Control sort of deck that had a bunch of grists in it and all sorts of different weird combos like Legolas's Quick Reflexes and Seeker of Skybreak. And the Grief Scam deck was actually so popular at the time, and it seemed like it just didn't really have all that many bad matchups except for the deck that I was playing. So I decided to register it at Eternal Weekend and basically did the opposite of hitting the matchup lottery. I played like Doomsday and Storm and like all sorts of stuff that was just not in the cards for me having a successful Eternal Weekend. But you and Tommy took this deck, and I believe you both made the money, right?
Yeah, I was in the cash for sure. I kind of made it to day two and then fell off. But I really enjoyed playing the deck. It was kind of fun and challenging. It wasn't like overpowered because like you could do some pretty busted stuff in the early turns, like grief scam your opponent, but the closing speed of the deck was quite slow. So you gave your opponent a bunch of time really to kind of like claw your way back. And so it kind of ended up being this like scrappy game on very low resources. But, I did enjoy the deck at the time. Again, I got paired into lands at 5-0 on table one and then had a draw and ended up in the draw bracket of this particular event. And it was really, really problematic because probably the worst matchup for this deck was like slow Swords to Plowshares control decks. And that's basically what I got paired into for the rest of the tournament. So it was, I had a decent finish, but man, it was a real battle all the way to the end.
Yeah, no doubt. And while we were sitting here putting Delver aside, basically saying like, look, Delver's no good here. We need to be either grief scamming or playing some, stupid, ridiculous Agatha Soul Cauldron deck. Our friend of the show, Jay just basically takes Grixis Delver all the way to the finals again. Back-to-back years, he's in the finals of Eternal Weekend with a Delver variant. This time he's on effectively the same Grixis Delver deck that we had, been toying around with for the better part of the summer of 2023.
Yup, looks real good. And so he wins North America, and 2 weeks later, I believe, Julian Jakobovits wins Eternal Weekend Europe with Blue-Red Delver Splashing Questing Druid, which is kind of still around today. So we kind of like got, pigeonholed or rabbit holed into this scam deck, and then, Delver just ends up rising to the top once again.
Yeah, and it's cool too when you look at the timeline from start to finish. If you go back 10 years to 2013, we're looking at also just Grixis Delver, and we're looking at Teamer Delver. But they're very different from 2023 when we had Grixis Delver and we had Teamer Delver. So it's like we came full circle here, and the J and the Juju Beans of the world just never gave up on it, and they made it happen because at the end of the day, the deck is going to provide you the results that are equivalent to your skill level. There really isn't a whole lot of lucky wins that you get with the deck, and there really isn't like a whole lot of, I couldn't do anything and I died. Like that just doesn't really exist with this deck.
Yep, and this is kind of interesting too, right? Because Delver gets to the finals of North America. It wins in Europe, but coming up, for the next BNR announcement, there's no bans at all. Like the Wizards or WotC kind of decides that the format's in a pretty reasonable place. There's reasonable deck diversity, and we don't get any bans at all. I think it was January of that year. There was nothing that touched the legacy format. So it's kind of interesting, because it kind of sticks out here in the timeline.
This is where everyone was calling for Grief's head, though. I do remember the call for Grief to be banned in the January BNR was quite high, and when we didn't get it, it was a massive disappointment. And actually, this is really where the legacy scene around Denver started to thin out. I think a lot of folks were really tired of getting griefed and then having either the best card in their best creature in their hand reanimated, or just having the grief getting reanimated and taking another card. I think folks were really tired of that, and that this is where we ended up getting 3 more months of grief, really. Or I guess it wasn't banned until August of 2024, but additional months of grief passed when I think most of the legacy community was done with the card.
No, I agree. I kind of wanted to point this out for this reason, and I'm glad you brought it up. This is a point where Wizards likely should have taken some action in the format, and they didn't. And this is kind of leading up to what we've had today. It's been a year and change, and there really hasn't been that much fundamentally, shift in the format at all. And they should have banned grief, I think, after this format, even though it didn't dominate. They should probably have used the same metric that they used for Sensei's Divining Top, in that it's just not a good play experience. like no one likes it, right? It's not necessarily on power level, even though it probably should have been. So I agree with you. I think they should have banned Grief in early 24 after Eternal Weekend, but they did not. And then the other thing that happens, which is kind of one of these interesting things, in February of 2024 was the first time that I found one of these Grief scam decks that had brought Entomb into the deck. And this, like, after this went on, everyone's like, oh my God, why did we not do this like 6 months ago when we were prepping for Eternal Weekend? It seems so obvious in retrospect that you just take this amazing Grief Reanimate deck and you put Entomb in it, right? Like, it's just like just a aha moment that I just remember when I first saw this. I was like, oh my God, why didn't I think of this 6 months ago?
Yeah, it was a huge revelation, and that parlays into another abomination of a Modern Horizons set that gave basically the perfect card to that deck, being Psychic Frog. So Psychic Frog serves all the purposes of a tempo card while also bolstering the Entomb package. I can't say like the utility of this card, like it just had endless amounts of utility. We even had folks like friend of the show, Kendall Frame. He would put Echo of Eons in his Psychic Frog deck to dump it, to put a counter on it, and then spin the libraries with like a Shieldred or a Bowmasters in play. Psychic Frog just totally blew open the tempo sort of shell. We still had your Grixis Delver decks, but they largely replaced all of their Orcish Bowmasters with Psychic Frogs because it was just a better threat, and it facilitated Murktide Regent. So we got basically the perfect card across the entire board for every version of tempo that existed in Legacy at the time.
Yep. And, there's a bunch of other crazy MH3 cards, obviously, Vexing Bauble, Kozilek's Command, Nadu, etc. So this is a huge infusion of power into the Legacy format. And the following ban, which happens in August of 24, 2 months after MH3 is released, they only ban Grief, which, again, is probably 6 months overdue at least. So, we go into Eternal Weekend this last year. You and I prepped for this event a lot, but it was very clearly defined by the MH3 cards.
Yeah, we decided to play a blue-black Tameo Frog sort of tempo style deck. I would still consider it to be in the Delver family, but this was so dominated by Vexing Bauble. So Vexing Bauble is just a colorless mana for a Bauble card, and what it says is if a card is cast and no mana was spent to cast it, it's countered, and then you can also pay one, tap it, and sack it to draw a card. So this card stopped Force of Will and it stopped Daze. So we really had to change our heuristics around what hands can we keep in order to fight the one ring or the 8 key one ring / Karn / Kozilek's command deck that Kelvin Wallace took to the promised land.
Eternal Weekend this last year was clearly dominated by MH3, and it was really impressive to see Kelvin play the deck. I mean, it's very rare if you look back over this last history of 10 years of looking at Eternal Weekends that a deck that won the tournament was an unknown basically before the event, but it really was here. Like, this is not a thing that you and I tested against. No one's playing it locally. Like, they had kind of kept it a secret. The playtest group in Seattle, they were crushing on Magic Online. They'd get 4-0 in their league and then drop so that the results weren't posted to Goldfish, and just completely dominated the tournament. I remember standing there watching Ari Lax playing Painter versus another key ring deck like Kelvin played, and like they were just in a whole nother league. Like, that deck was just totally ridiculous. And again, it's like the best way to abuse the One Ring.
Agreed. Yeah. And so where does that leave us now? We're in March of 2025. That last bullet there was from November of 2024. There hasn't been any real tremendous changes to Legacy after the banning of Vexing Bauble and Psychic Frog, which I think came in December, correct me if I'm wrong, December or January.
Yeah, I should have put that on here.
Yeah, no worries. So we got Vexing Bauble banned, we got Psychic Frog banned, and now Delver's sort of in this spot where there's still 4 or 5 versions hanging out around, around in the metagame, where we see the Teamer version splashing for Questing Druid, which is a modal card that it's a colorless and a red at instant speed. You can do a Ren's Resolve effect or like a Reckless Impulse sort of effect in your opponent's end step and then play those cards on your turn. Then it's also 1 and a green for a 1/1 creature that gets a +1/+1 counter whenever you cast a spell that's not green or colorless. So that's one adaptation we've seen. We've seen the Grixis Delver deck also make a comeback where we're bringing Orcish Bowmasters back into the fold with a card called Molten Collapse 2, which is black-red, and it's got a few different modes, one of them being destroy a non-creature, non-land permanent with CMC 1 or less. Then you also have a Dreadbore attached to that too, so just destroy target creature or planeswalker. And then it has Descend, so you get to pick 2 modes if you've descended that turn. And what Descend means is a permanent entered your graveyard that turn. So whether that's a Mishra's Bauble or a fetch land, or you surveilled away any of those cards, any permanents into the graveyard with your DRC, that would turn on Descend, and you can Molten Collapse for 2 modes. So then we also see the Is It Delver version, which I highlighted in, it was either episode 1 or 2 of the pod, that I took to Chicago, and I played like 2 islands and some Magus of the Moons in the sideboard and some Tamios in the main. So that version I thought was really good. And now we're seeing Stock Up plus Mystic Sanctuary, and Mystic Sanctuary is making a comeback into the Delver lists because we're now sort of seeing a repeat play pattern of Expressive Iteration, then you Mystic Sanctuary, Expressive Iteration. Well, now it's going to be Stock Up, Mystic Sanctuary, Stock Up. So it's sort of going back to the fold of 2022.
Yeah, and even the blue-black tempo decks, which are not Delver decks typically, but they're playing Tamiyo and Bowmasters as card advantage engines and early threats are good too. So there is a good spread of tempo decks currently, but we're just kind of in this weird holding pattern where everyone's kind of expecting some shakeup in the format here in the next couple of weeks. And while I do think the Delver decks are competitive, they don't seem to be like at the top of the format, which is probably a fine place to be. But I do like that there is some innovation and that there are a couple of different combinations of colors that you can play today.
Definitely. So I don't see anything getting hit in Delver at the end of this month. If anything, I think we might see a couple cards come back. I've already hinted at those a few times, but other than that, Lee, I think I've exhausted all the knowledge that I have of Delver. How are you feeling?
No, that was a whole bunch, and it was kind of fun to go through it all. So I will actually post this timeline in the Discord, and I may post it on Twitter as well, just so people have access to it. It took me a while to put it together, but it was kind of a fun trip down memory lane.
No doubt. Well, I think we'll wrap it up there, folks. I hope you appreciated this episode. I know we didn't cover any of our usual events that happen throughout each week, but Lee and I wanted to make this as sort of a special episode, and I'm hoping that we'll be able to do more of these deck histories with other experts that we know around the area.
Yeah, I was just going to say, if anybody listening wants to come onto the pod and be a guest and talk about a deck that they've played for a long time and they have expertise in, we'd love to have you. And for everybody else, thanks for listening.
All right. Thank you.